It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are concluding our pro wrestling portrait of corruption. I guess that's what we should call it, a portrait of corruption. What do you think, John?
That's perfect.
Perfect. So how are you?
Good. Good.
Well, that's always good to know that you're good. So I guess we'll jump right in since we're both good. How about that?
Good.
Good. Okay. So, anywho, as I said earlier, we are going to finish our history of pro wrestling, and we are at a brand new term, and it's called the sports entertainment era. That coincides with the time that the WWE basically took over wrestling. So this era is going to be the story of the WWE, or are we going to see some other stuff?
It's mostly the story of the WWE, the crappiest, most awful company in history. And we're talking about the company, just the business side. We're not even going to talk about how terrible Vince McMahon, the head of it, the guy in charge of this that entire time is. We're not going to talk at all about his, various sexual assaults, alleged in air quotes. We're not going to talk about how he supposedly got not fighters, but wrestlers, I should say, compelled them or coerced them into doing large amounts of steroids. We're not going to talk about the gross negligence that led to a death of a wrestler. None of that has to do with this. We're just talking about the business side. And I might, maybe the people think I'm harsh, but this is the man that put my beloved American Wrestling Association out of business. So there's nothing I can't say bad about him enough.
One of these days, I would love for you to cover Vince McMahon and his father, too.
We are going to talk a little about Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon Sr. today, Jr. and Sr.
See,
so the Vince McMahon, we don't talk not about him, but we are focusing on his business efforts, the business model, what he did with the business, and what happened in this era more than his other activities.
But I bet that this business stuff is just as icky as his other activities.
It is. And without this business stuff, without attaining the power he did, it's probably not possible that he couldn't have obtained the power, like we said, from the WWE to do the terrible stuff he did in his personal life and, still in the company, to use that leverage to get people to do such repulsive stuff for him.
Gotcha. All right. So since it's in part huge about the WWE, I guess why you call it the sports entertainment era is due to that. But can you explain why you call it this for the listeners? Because remember, yesterday I was calling it the Attitude Era. I was thinking that maybe you were speaking to the Attitude Era, but I know you're speaking of something different. So
yeah, the Attitude Era, which I did not watch pro wrestling during that time. I should note, I was a big pro wrestling fan as a kid, but I stopped in about 88, around 87, 88, watching pro wrestling around the time the WWF, as it was known at the time, took over. So the Attitude Era is a later period, and that's inside what I call that's a period within this era of the sports entertainment era. And the term this is the term that Vince McMahon coined to use instead of calling it pro wrestling. And that's why I use it. And it has its roots in 1989 when a spokesperson for the World Wrestling Federation testified at the New Jersey State Senate that pro wrestling was strictly entertainment, a performance instead of a competition. So it was finally going public that pro wrestling wasn't fixed, but it was a performance. And then later, a few days later, Vince McMahon and Linda McMahon both testified under oath in civil lawsuits that their product was pre-scripted. And a big part of this was all done to get pro wrestling away from athletic commissions. So I would argue, though, that this era started even a bit earlier than this, when he started putting on a more kid-friendly, cartoonish style of wrestling compared to his competitors. And the admission just cemented that we were now completely in this new era. So the era might start earlier, but this unquestionably, when he finally admits it's no longer, it's a performance and not even a fixed match or whatever, that there's nothing real about it, that is, we can for sure call that the start, at least the latest date that we could start this, the sports entertainment era.
Side question here, because I can't resist. You said something in there that caught my ear. You said Linda McMahon also testified in that.
Yes.
Okay, so this was in the 80s, right? You said 89?
Yes.
Okay, that predates her public, persona as involved with the company. Like, we didn't get to see anything like that until the very late 90s, early aughts, before she became intrinsically linked to WWE as somebody that, was in the back operating stuff. So you're telling me that she was already with her hands in the business side all the way back in the 80s.
Yes, my understanding. Now, again, I stopped watching wrestling in the late 80s. So a lot of this I'm picking up through osmosis, through people on Twitter, because you guys still love pro wrestling. And then reading books. I should recommend right away off the bat that my previous one, Jonathan Snowden's Shooters, is a book I went to for a lot of sources, plus my own research, plus other books and stuff. So, but I would say that my understanding is she was involved with the business at a much earlier time, but when he came up with the Mr. McMahon character, I guess people call it, when, the boss became, instead of being just a commentary announcer, and it took over as like the evil president of the company, he started introducing his family, and they all stepped in the front in the limelight. So they came out of the shadows at that point.
But that was much later. I'm just surprised that she was with her hands in the business a lot, or like a decade earlier than anybody thought. That's just interesting to me.
I guess that's surprising to pro wrestling fans. For me, I would know.
That's crazy. All right. So now that it's completely removed from even pretending it's a sport, why do we want to talk about it on our show that covers a legitimate combat sport like MMA or boxing?
Legitimate for now. No, there's for a couple reasons. First, the company has some impact on how combat sports works today. As we discussed earlier, how MMA titles use the model of pro wrestling, they introduced that instead of using the ones by boxing, and how that's impacted the sport. So that's one reason. We have, obviously, we're using the pro wrestling model for how instead of sanctioning organizations and independent with boxing. Also, the business model, the way the weekly shoulder programming was used. Pro wrestling, I don't know what they're called, Raw, I guess one of them is called now, but we have weekly shows on pro wrestling. And for the UFC, they did the Ultimate Fighter as a weekly show, plus the fight nights. And they used that to build up to a monthly pay-per-view, just as the WWE, as it was by then called, what they were doing. So the business model, in fact, the Fertittas famously said, Lorenzo, that one of the first things they did was they downloaded all the financials they could get for the WWF, because they were going to base a lot of their planning on that. The presentation of both the boxing and MMA, and especially with MMA and the fan base, there's a lot of crossover. So all those reasons, and probably most importantly, finally, it's kind of interesting just on its own. So for all those reasons, that's why we're going to talk about it.
How did our last era, which for those of you listening, you should definitely go back and check out the first half of this because it's completely free. But we spoke about the kayfabe era. So how did that become the sports entertainment era?
Okay, we are going to have to understand what pro wrestling was like at this time, the time during the sports entertainment era, and we're going to have to go back over some of the things that happened in the previous episode. So if you recall, in the worked in kayfabe era, we talked about the trusts that ruled wrestling and how they started coming up with their own sanctioned titles, right? We also mentioned that the promoters' territories, so we barely mentioned them, so we need to get a little more detail about them. Because one, wrestling was worked or staged back then. And two, technology had improved with phones, telegrams, and trains. This allowed wrestling to be easily booked in multiple matches across multiple cities. So promoters found that they could easily control large areas and make much more money booking many times as big shows as they did before. Okay. And so without legitimate champions too, like, with the sanctioning organizations, the way boxing worked, the champions hold all the power. And so the promoter and manager that has them has all the power. The power was dispersed. And so the promoters and the wrestlers could arrange and program big matches on their own. And so the country became divided into territories who had actual or implied agreements to let everybody run their own fiefs, to be left alone. So they could also have their own titles, as we discussed, with both Paul Bowser of the AWA and then later Verne Gagne of the same name, AWA, but a different one. After World War II, most territories belonging to the cartel of the NWA colluded to control the sport, and then other territories left the NWA to go off on their own, and that was the AWA, as we mentioned, but also the WWF, which would become the WWF. This was run by Toots Mondt and Vince McMahon Sr. The WWF was just one of many territories, dividing up the country, paying dues into the NWA. So when they left to run on their own and competing, and all of them competed against each other for talent, but not trying to compete too much for fans. That's why they divided the country up that way. It's when Vince McMahon buys the WWF from his father and changes the name to the WWF that we start moving from the kayfabe area into the sports entertainment area. So I hope that gives people an overview of where we're headed with this.
What makes Vince McMahon the person to instigate this change? Well, what was he doing that was different from everybody else at that time?
Well, as Vince came in and his dad, he purchased the company around in the turn of the 1980s. The main reason he started it is he treated pro wrestling with disdain. Vince did not grow up with his father. He grew up separately. This is kind of an interesting psychological thing about this. His dad, he was born out of wedlock to a different woman, wasn't recognized by his dad until his late teens, until he acknowledged him. So he did not grow up in the business. After his father acknowledged him later in life and then gave him a chance to work in the business, he did not have the same relationship with the business as others did who entered the professional because they had a deep love or interest in pro wrestling or because they were raised in it. So it gave him a perspective that others lacked. He had no sense of loyalty or need for continuation with the territory model. There's a quote he says in Sports Illustrated back in 2014, I believe. In the old days, there were wrestling fiefdoms all over the country, each with their own little lord in charge. Each little lord respected the rights of his neighboring little lord. No takeovers or raids were allowed. There were maybe 30 of these tiny kingdoms in the U.S., and if I hadn't bought out my dad, there'd still be 30 of them fragmented and struggling. I, of course, had no allegations to these little lords. So it kind of showed he did not even believe in the territorial system. He also recognized changes in the media landscape that were coming that would make it easier to transform the business. And he saw the potential Hulk Hogan had. That's another thing. And especially he saw the potential Hulk Hogan had. Others recognized Hulk Hogan as a star, but he recognized him as something that he could put into what he viewed pro wrestling, which again was a more kind of childish, a more disdainful version, I would argue, than previous pro wrestling. Like he didn't respect the way it was. He wanted to put it doing something where if you thought little pro wrestling, you could enjoy it as well because you could kind of laugh at it. So others didn't recognize this, but he did, and he had a plan they could fit Hogan into, and he's willing to use predatory tactics that maybe others weren't ready for as well to make his plan come to fruition.
Was all of that why, this is a side question again, was all of that why Ted Turner's WCW only lasted for 13 years? Because Vince was so predatory and basically, I guess mercurial. He didn't give a shit. He just like cut your throat.
The WCW, which was, I guess, the NWA, they replaced the NWA in the late 80s. But the WCW that people remember in the mid to late 90s when Ted Turner put a lot of support behind him as kind of a rival again for the WWF at that, as they were called that time. I'm going to call them the WWF for simplicity for me because that's how I know them as. WWE is a later name, so screw that. But the WWF, they started challenging him. Well, the WWF had kind of won already. And so this rival that appeared was deep pockets of Ted Turner coming in. And my understanding, they did rival and did threaten the WWF. But what finished them off was not the WWF. I mean, the WWF engaged in tremendously predatory, I shouldn't say predatory, but tremendously hostile actions against them, but so did the WCW. So they were much more on a level playing field. It's the management at the WCW that basically ran them in the ground, weakened them, and made an opportunity for the WWF to purchase them. And, in some ways, maybe they should have been blocked that purchase because you've taken a player off the map and someone else maybe should have had the right to buy WCW, but that's a different argument. But yeah, the WCW is it's one of the promotions that's less due to the WWF, although the WWF made it impossible. If you screw up, you're doomed because of the landscape they'd created. But almost all the blame goes to WCW's management themselves.
Oh, okay. Okay, got you. What are some of the predatory tactics that you were talking about that he did? Give me specific examples. To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!